Hello, this is Bob with Thrive Wellness. So this is our first wellness presentation for the Wellness Your Way 2.0 program. So all of the wellness and health education topics that we touch on going forward will all build from this one topic area. So today's first topic, reduce your chronic disease risk, proactive steps for primary prevention. So today's agenda, a few things we will touch on. Statistics on chronic disease. What does it actually mean to be at risk for a disease or condition? We'll take a look at modifiable risk factors versus non-modifiable risk factors. We'll also take a look at intermediate risk factors, stress and how stress impacts chronic disease risk. We'll take a look at a newer concept, chronic inflammation, and how that impacts chronic disease risk. We'll take a look at a few keys to prevention and early detection for chronic disease. And we'll also touch on taking steps to reduce chronic disease risk. Prevalence of chronic disease. When I say chronic disease, I'm really referring to kind of the big three, so heart disease, diabetes, and cancer. You can also certainly throw in things like stroke, chronic diseases of the lung, and Alzheimer's disease. So during a span from the late 1950s, early 1960s, through the early 2000s, most chronic diseases either doubled or in some cases even tripled in prevalence. Currently, 1 in 2 adults has a chronic disease, and 1 in 4 adults has 2 or more chronic diseases. So certainly these chronic conditions still very, very prevalent in our society. So the next few slides, we'll take a look at some of the causes and some of the risk factors for those chronic diseases. So what does it actually mean to be at risk for a chronic disease or condition? So being at risk simply means that there is some presence of a lifestyle, genetic, or biometric value that increases your chance of a specific or set of chronic diseases. So we tend to assess risk looking at a variety of different factors, some pertaining to weight, some blood chemistry and biometric measurements, as well as lifestyle factors, everything from diet to exercise to how we internalize and manage stress. So it's a great idea to know what your risk factors are. And that helps you to be able to make educated decisions about your health and wellness. So some of you have actually just gone through a health screening, and that's going to give you some great information about your general health status. So if there's something you don't like in there, you can begin to pick apart some of those measurements and health behavioral factors and possibly decide to do something different. Causes of chronic disease. So chronic diseases have been studied significantly over the last several generations. And one thing is important to point out, the development of chronic disease is very much a process. It takes time. So we generally don't just wake up one morning and have a diagnosis of heart disease or diabetes. There's likely years of circumstances that have led up to a potential diagnosis. But certainly risk factors such as diet or exercise, age from a non-modifiable risk, as well as intermediate risk factors, things like recognizing blood pressure might be going up or blood lipids are going up over time. So another important thing to point out, once we begin to hit those intermediate risk factors, there's likely already a sign that something's going on in the body to cause those things to become elevated. So a great time to kind of take note of those things. But we'll cover each one of those risk factors in greater detail with the next series of slides. Non-modifiable risk factors. So I don't want to spend a great amount of time on this category, but it is important to at least mention this area. So these are the risk factors that we really don't have any control over, right? So age, cannot control our current age. Ethnic background, genetics, family history, these aren't things we really have any say on. The good thing is all of the recent research, really over the last several generations, has uncovered that about 70 to 90% of chronic disease risk is related to lifestyle and environment. So certainly those things, those non-modifiable risk factors that we can't control, they do play some emphasis and some role on chronic disease development. However, they are a minor factor in relationship to all those things that we do have control over, such as our diet, our exercise patterns, our levels of stress, whether we maintain weight or don't maintain weight over time. So we'll kind of get into some of those modifiable risk factor areas next. Modifiable risk factors. So these are the things that we do have a lot of control over. We can control what we put on our plate and how much we put on our plate. We can control how much we move our bodies, whether that movement comes throughout our regular day or whether it comes in a gym or on a run. And we certainly have some control over whether we choose to use tobacco or not. So the next few slides we'll look at discuss some of the links between our lifestyle habits and their impact on chronic disease. So most of the research now points to the fact that it's really our lifestyle habits which are the key drivers behind whether we get chronic diseases or we're able to avoid them until late in life. Nutrition and chronic disease risk. So these are the findings from an American Journal of Clinical Nutrition study regarding nutrition's impact on chronic disease. I'll just read this for you. Chronic disease does not arise from any one dietary culprit, but from a complex interaction of multiple nutritional factors directly linked to the excessive consumption of common industrial foods, such as dairy products, refined cereals, refined grains, refined sugars, refined vegetable oils, fatty meats and salts, and the combination of these foods. So the biggest factor there is, just to boil it down in its simplest terms, our diet tends to consist of far too many refined processed foods and not enough simple whole plant-based foods are the biggest factors. And this link has been studied thoroughly and is really well understood at this point in time. So how about exercise and chronic disease risk? Sedentary lifestyles increase all causes of morbidity, double the risk of obesity, cardiovascular disease, and diabetes. Sedentary lifestyles also increase the risk for cancer, high blood pressure, osteoporosis, depression, and anxiety. This is from the World Health Organization. So how much activity do we really need? Well, the American College of Sports Medicine recommends that we get about 150 minutes per week of moderate exercise. However, there's still a great deal of benefit to be had from much less exercise, even 1 hour a week of moderate physical activity. Even good brisk walking can reduce the risk of heart disease and stroke by up to 20%. Modifiable risk factors in chronic conditions. So eliminating just 3 lifestyle risk factors, poor diet, lack of exercise or physical activity, and smoking, would prevent 80% of heart disease, 80% of type 2 diabetes, and 40% of cancer. This is from the Centers for Disease Control. So there's long been a debate regarding what causes chronic disease. Is it more related to our genes, our environment, or is it our lifestyle? And the most up-to-date and the prevalence of literature and research would definitely indicate that our lifestyle, what we choose to put on our plate, and how much we move our body, and avoiding cigarette smoking are the biggest factors, and we have a lot of control over those factors. So feel good about that and recognize that you do have a lot of power in your ability to avoid chronic disease. So we've covered some of those modifiable risk factors for chronic disease and non-modifiable risk factors. So that brings us to those intermediate risk factors for chronic disease. So remember, once these things begin to show up, that's already likely a sign that there's something going wrong in the body. There's some dysfunction going on, likely related to some of those modifiable type risk factors. So again, if we're seeing increased blood pressure, abnormal blood glucose, increased blood lipids, those are some things that definitely are pointing to some intermediate or some progress towards a chronic condition. So great to take note of those things when we do see them coming up. Now we'll take a look at some of those intermediate risk factors, the first being weight, measured by the body mass index, which of course the BMI is a number that relates your weight to your height. So you see the different classifications everywhere from underweight to normal weight, overweight, obese, severely obese, and morbidly obese. So as you progress upward in the BMI, your health risks do increase. And weight is one of those things that impacts basically every single one of our risk factors and risk for chronic disease, everything from heart disease to diabetes and even certain cancers. So overweight individuals have 2 to 3 times the increased risk of coronary artery disease and hypertension, and a full 10-fold increased risk of type 2 diabetes. So certainly controlling or managing weight over time is one surefire way to help reduce your risk of chronic disease. Now we'll take a look at blood pressure as an intermediate risk factor. So blood pressure, of course, is a very common risk factor for heart disease, stroke, and diseases of the kidney as well. It's believed that of individuals who have their first heart attack, 7 in 10 of them have high blood pressure. And individuals who have their first stroke, 8 in 10 of them have high blood pressure. So what's considered normal? Systolic, or the normal number, or the top number, under 120, and the diastolic, or the bottom number, under 80. And as you climb that from elevated to stage 1, stage 2 hypertension, of course, your risk factors for not only heart disease and certainly stroke do increase exponentially. So how about lipids as an intermediate risk factor? So pertaining to cholesterol and triglyceride values are a risk factor certainly for heart disease and stroke, and a linking associated risk factor with diabetes as well. So we see the desirable values on the left side of that graph. And then as you climb to borderline and high risk, certainly your overall risk for heart disease, stroke, and diabetes do increase with those values. So certainly a good thing to recognize, know where your values stand in assessing your overall risk and potentially making lifestyle changes in these areas as you go forward. So moving along to blood glucose as an intermediate risk factor. So blood sugar, blood glucose, is pertaining to our risk for diabetes. So any value below 165 to 99 is considered normal. Once we get into an area above 100 to 125, that's considered a pre-diabetic or borderline diabetic range. So again, that's a sign that there's already some level of dysfunction going on in the body. We're not processing and moving that blood sugar out of the bloodstream as efficiently as we should. And full-blown diabetes occurs when you have multiple fasting blood sugar readings of above 125 in the morning. So a part of the overall risk with diabetes is all the ancillary risk factors that go along with it, from issues with your eyes, issues with kidneys, and probably one of the biggest ones is the fact that diabetics have a 2 to 3 times increased risk for heart disease. So again, it's a great idea to know your numbers, right? Know what your blood sugar is, know your blood pressure, know your lipids. It's something that can certainly help you reduce your risks over time. Metabolic syndrome and chronic disease. Metabolic syndrome is a collection of signs and symptoms that together greatly increase your overall risk factors for heart disease, diabetes, even certain forms of cancer. So those various signs and symptoms are visceral or abdominal fat, insulin resistance or issues with blood sugar, low HDL value, hypertension, or high triglycerides.